This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Hi, welcome back to Storytelling Animals, a podcast of climate ecology and animal justice where we use books to think about our environmental crisis and what comes next, how to move forward. Today, my guest is Carol Gigliotti. She is the author most recently of The Creative Lives of Animals, and that's the book we talk about. It came out in November 2022. And in that book, she covers a variety of different ways in which animals exercise creativity in their day-to-day lives, from the prairie dogs who can find ways to communicate everything from the speed and species of an approaching predator to whether a human they saw might have a gun, to even innovating new sounds when confronted with novel stimuli. And that's essentially what creativity is for Gigliotti. We talk about it in the interview, but it's not just capital C creativity of making a painting or a sculpture, but engaging in novel behaviors that, a different bird might have sung a slightly different song, and these sort of individual acts of creativity, of responding to their environment, are ways of animals expressing their individuality in ways that ultimately end up shaping their own lives out of their ecosystems, that of their species, and in some cases, as we discuss, the path of their species' whole evolution. So this marks episode 1 of a 3 or 4 episode series I'll be doing on the topic of animal agency. I think, the different forms of creativity I talk about with Carol, are a good intro to this topic. But more broadly, the reason I want to do a specific series on animal agency is because it's something that came up tangentially in a lot of the episodes from season 1. But I think we typically only mention it briefly and don't have time to dive into the implications. Some on the political left even have used animals' perceived lack of agency as an excuse, just to justify their continued subjugation. The argument is that animals are mere objects of history, while humans are the subjects, that we take our lives and our worlds into our own hands and create them ourselves, and other animals just kind of exist. And first, this were true, I don't know that it would justify oppressing them, eating them, torturing them, putting them in small cages. That's probably cruel no matter what. But I think looking specifically at animal agency is important for at least 3 reasons. The first of which is that it changes the way we look at other animals. It changes, how we understand them. It makes us, in lots of ways, empathize with them more, and challenges some of these sort of poorer arguments for subjugating them. Secondly, it has very concrete implications on what we should do to give other animals the best possible lives, also in ways that affect our own lives. For instance, with biodiversity, we have to understand that preserving other species isn't just about, preserving inert lumps of genetic code, but about, other animals who, do actions in their ecosystems. They build dams, they build tools, and then their relatives learn how to build those tools, and those tools spread throughout their culture. And these acts of creativity are part of how those animals sustain themselves and how those entire ecosystems function. So if we aren't looking at the ways in which animals are agents, we don't understand totally what it is we're trying to conserve and how best to conserve it. This is also relevant in more domestic contexts, right? Like, again, if we think of our dogs or cats as agents, as individuals who act upon the world, maybe we realize that, a dog who sits on a pill all day eating treats, might have a better life than some dogs, but actually isn't having, that great of a life for a dog, because sniffing, playing, digging, stuff like that is important to a dog exercising its dogness and feeling, genuinely satisfied in his or her life. So looking at animal agency shapes, I think, how we think about how to give animals good lives. And thirdly, the reason to look at other animal agency is that I think it offers different possibilities for the sorts of relationships we can have with them. That, animal rights, animal liberation isn't just necessarily a question of us doing stuff for them or not doing stuff to them, but there may be space to sort of act more collaboratively or at least more responsively to each other, that it can maybe be a collective interspecies project in some way. That last point isn't something we're going to talk about so much today, but I have a future episode planned about it. Stay tuned. If you want to discuss these ideas about animal agency with me, we have 2 upcoming book clubs where you can do just that. So May 2nd, that's a Tuesday at 8:30 Eastern, 5:30 Pacific, we will be discussing Wild Souls, Freedom and Flourishing in the Non-Human World by Emma Maris. That's a nonfiction book about the ways in which, thinking about animal autonomy and agency in the wild, should and shouldn't reshape how we approach conservation, and sometimes the conflict between holistic ecological goals and individual animal well-being. It's a really interesting book, a lot to talk about, a lot to think about, some possibly controversial arguments, but some worthwhile ones, so I hope some of you will join me there. And these are all Zoom book clubs, by the way. You can also listen to the interview I did with Emma Maris if you want to join the book club, but don't want to read the whole book. That should give you at least enough to chew on to take part in the conversation. And then on June 27th, which is a Tuesday as well, at the same time, we'll be discussing Plague Dogs, a novel by Richard Adams from, I believe, the 1970s. He's the author of Watership Down, which I read and loved as a kid, and I'm sure many of you did. The Plague Dogs is a book he wrote maybe for slightly older audiences about dogs who escape from a research lab. And so it explores, themes of animal resistance, animal rights, animal research, and there is also a movie version of this book where, again, if you don't want to read the whole book, but you want to take part in the discussion, you can watch the movie. So to join those book clubs, you can either sign up for my free weekly newsletter for more information, and you'll get a free trial membership from that, or to join on a more permanent basis. Please support this podcast on Patreon, patreon.com/storytellingpod, at the Lorax tier or higher. Any tier will get you advanced access to episodes, and some new stuff on animal agency coming soon, and some other episodes I'm excited about too. So without further ado, here is Carol Gigliotti on the creative lives of animals. Hi, I'm here with Carol Gigliotti, the author of The Creative Lives of Animals, out this year. Carol, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
So, your book is about animals and their creative lives. You're an author, artist, activist. How did you kind of first become interested in writing about, thinking about doing art and activism around non-human animals?
Well, doing my own art and activism, I've been doing that pretty much since I became a visual artist. I was in theater and have an undergraduate degree in performance, but I didn't enjoy saying other people's words, which really makes it hard if you're an actor. So, I began to print, do printmaking, and then painting, and so my subject was always animals and our relationship with them. I had begun being vegetarian when I was 16, so I was pretty, starting to be aware at 16 of these issues, and that's what I did, and then I did a master's in printmaking, and then I, much later just as I hit 40, I started a doctoral program at the Advanced Computing Center for Art and Design, and I was again working with the same sorts of issues, animal issues, but I also had to write a dissertation, and when I started writing my dissertation, I realized I kind of liked writing. It was in terms of what I was trying to say about animals, it was sometimes easier and had more clarity. So I didn't right away get into writing about animals with my dissertation, but I wrote about ethics and technology. So then I wrote lots about ethics and technology, mostly about virtual environments, and I, finished the PhD, having done high-end animation and written a dissertation. So I then continued with that. I always had ideas about animals in my writing, but I got really involved with critiquing biotech and bioart, and nobody was stupid or brave enough to, which I am both, which is difficult sometimes. So I really started looking at what people were doing with animals and in the larger view, what was being done to animals in biotechnology, what kind of impact it was having on them. So I did that. But while I put out an edited book called Leonardo's Choice. And while I was working on that, the idea that art, a lot of artists felt that there was no limit to what they could do and that art should never be censored, which, I agree with. It's just that I also believe that, causing pain to any being for an art project is not acceptable. And so that was one of the ways that I sort of got involved with the idea of what are the limits of creativity. And from that, I became interested in really what creativity was and sort of coming to the idea that, well, if people, humans, beings are creative, well, certainly animals must be also. And then I started to really look at the idea that animals might be creative too, and with early on, but it wasn't until probably 2012 that I started really researching the topic and found, I was on the right track.
Great. And so that's a nice segue into my next question, which is going to be, what do we mean by creativity?
Well, defining creativity itself is always a fraught process. Many people have tried to define it, and of course, when they do, they usually come from their own field of study, whether that's biology or psychology, history, for instance, cultural studies, and art historical studies. So you get all these different kinds of definitions of creativity, but I wanted to broaden, as a number of biologists were doing. Not that many at the time, but there were biologists and psychologists who were thinking about broadening creativity to include animals. But I wanted to define it in a way that I thought would be meaningful in a very broad sense. And I also wanted to bring to it my experience, because I'm not a biologist or a psychologist or a sociologist. I'm an artist. I have a background in the arts, and I guess philosophy too, because I have a lot of background in looking at things in philosophical ways. But I didn't want to come to it from really anything but being creative. What is it to be creative? So I defined creativity as a dynamic process in which novel and meaningful behaviors are generated by, and here is a sticking point, but it shouldn't be, by individuals with the possibility of affecting others at cultural, species, and evolutionary levels. The first part, novel and meaningful, the word meaningful, sometimes gives people pause. When I was asked to write an opinion essay for The Scientist, which was a shock to me. Like, really? And the editor, who was terrific, by the way, wanted to change the word meaningful. And I said, I think I don't want to do that because, number one, it's in the book. But number two, meaningful has really been supported by a number of different biologists and psychologists. In other words, it's meaningful, but it doesn't have to be meaningful to what's called large C or big C, the gigantic creativity that informs everything, and makes a real dent in whatever field you're in. But it could be just meaningful to the individual who is creative. So I wanted to keep that. And he was very generous and quite, like I said, really wonderful to work with. And he said, okay. And then the word individuals. And when I say individuals, there's lots of examples in the book that are about animals and I include, the whole kingdom of Animalia, including insects, to really look at individuals who are often seen as having a hive mind or, only having intelligence when they all work together. Well, actually, if you look at specific instances like bees, they actually work in some instances in what they do very much as individuals, and their individual creativity is really important. And we might talk about that later. But I think the important part of this, the last part of it, is the possibility of affecting others at cultural, species, and evolutionary levels. And those three things, I think, are really broaden what creativity can be. It's not a question of only including humans. You have to include all the different species in the world, and what that does to contribute to biodiversity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm glad you brought up insects because, I think, I'm sure we'll talk about the usual suspects like chimpanzees or whales or elephants, and, those are fascinating and important species to study, but something that I appreciate in your book is that it goes well beyond this to birds, reptiles, fish, and even, as you mentioned, insects. So, yeah, you cover ant intelligence, bee democracy, wasp play, fly architecture. What, maybe bees you mentioned, but you can pick any one of those, but what surprised you, or just tell us about their creativity?
I really, for me, the most interesting and actually the most documented in a lot of ways because of Thomas Seeley, the bee expert and biologist, were bees. Because when we think of bees, we immediately, especially if you're in, for instance, technology, the hive mind and the idea that there is this group way to think that can be very productive. But the idea that Seeley documented was that individuals really contributed as individuals to finding a nest for a new queen bee. That particular example, I think, is one that people can understand in a way. And I say this in the book, if you've ever, sat on a committee and you're trying to come up with creative ideas, sometimes it's brilliant. And most of the time, if you're sitting on a committee and you're trying to make a decision, it's like, oh, gee, I wish I was at the beach, anywhere, anywhere but here. But with bees, the scout bees actually work as individuals in finding examples or particular places where the nest, they think the nest would be perfect. And those places they bring back to the group and discuss them really with their dances, and then the other bees, the other scouts, will go and see that nest before they make their decision. So you get this incredibly open source kind of decision making where there's no one person making the decisions. But what Seeley says is when they come to a quorum, so it's not really a consensus, it's not really a compromise, it's that most of the bees decide that, yes, this is a good place. But the creativity of each of those bees has made a contribution to that. And I just think that's like the most wonderful example of insects being creative. It's so, again, it's very well documented. So, you can really get in there and just, I don't know about you, but I just imagine the bees, talking to each other and running around and finding places. And they have to find, again, something that I did not know, a very specific nest place that, is, and ants do this too. They have particular requirements that they have to meet that will make the best place. And ants do that as well. And I think I say in the book, it's, the thing about ants is that they do this, and as one of the researchers says, and they do this all while being a little speck. You think of that. I mean, ants are often, especially if you can't see very well like me, they are a speck. And they're doing these incredibly complex things that we just have never really noticed. And now, of course, so many biologists, ethologists are really making inroads into understanding things about bees. About insects in general, not just bees, but ants and other insects as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's important to draw out, because it's something that shapes a lot of your book, that, if maybe the conventional cultural thought about what is creativity is like, making a painting or a sculpture. But yeah, these bees, these ants their individual behaviors and choices are shaping the lives of their communities. And it's hard to define creativity in a way that excludes that sort of thing, because that's ultimately what they're doing.
Exactly. I mean, I think the point about it being creative is that, if you want to put it in human terms, they're really are planning a product of architecture, and they're looking for a place. And that is a very, that's always kind of a problem with architecture. Usually there's a particular place in human architecture, and then the building fits into the land or to the place, hopefully in a good way. But, this is sort of going the other way, but it's still very much the same process. So, yeah, I think it has all the qualities of a creative process. And one of the things that I'll just mention is that I try to emphasize the fact that to understand creativity, there is a creative process, at least for humans. Now, it might be very different with animals of all kinds in species-specific ways, but the qualities of that process are really similar. And so I came up with, words that I didn't come up with them, but I drew together a number of words that were always used in talking about creativity in any of the our human disciplines, but just in general. And I taught the creative arts, and not just the more traditional arts, but animation and interactive design and graphic novels. The creative process includes things like flexibility, intelligence, curiosity, inventiveness, persistence, and the last one I think is so important to both for being creative as an animal and for being creative as a person, and also just being creative in life, to be, especially, now, of course it's always been like this, I'm sure, but to be comfortable with complexity. And that's something that a lot of people are not because they don't have that quality to begin with, but because it's, at least in Western culture, it's really drummed out of it, of us. And so it's kind of frustrating. And that's, I think, leads to why we have a lot of people would have a hard time thinking about animals as creative, which is one of the reasons I wrote the book.
So you speak to a number of scientists throughout the book who study different aspects of animal behavior, ecology, cognition. You ask them questions about, whether they would consider birdsong to be creative or music. Was there anything that stood out to you or surprised you, or any themes that came up as you talked with scientists about how they look at animal creativity and how that impacts their work?
Yeah, it was interesting to talk to the wonderful Kon Slobodchikov, who wrote Chasing Dr. Dolittle, and his researches about prairie dogs and the language of prairie dogs. And he was, he's somebody that is just so comfortable with complexity. And he's a wonderful man. He was so generous with his time, and he was all for, yes, of course, animals are creative. And it was interesting because one of the big hurdles that has always been used as a wall between us and other animals is language. And here he is talking about, the language of prairie dogs. And what's interesting is that, of course, he received a great deal of static and refusal. But on the other hand, when people talk about his work, I've read this in different articles where, somebody will be asked, another scientist, another biologist will be asked, well, is the research possible? I mean, is this something that you would say was good research? And they're like, absolutely, there is nothing I can find that's wrong about it. And it sounds like they really tried, but they they couldn't. And then to talk to somebody like Don Kreutzma, who, obviously I read the books of a number of people I talked to. I read a lot before I interviewed, just like you do. And when I talked to Don Kreutzma, I have a number of his books, and he uses the word creativity throughout a number of his books. He's an ornithologist. He's won many awards. He's spent his life in the field, just like Kon Slobodchikov with prairie dogs. He's spent his life in the field with birds and recording bird song. But when I was interviewing him, he really had trouble with my use of the word creativity. And I was like, wait a minute, how come you can use it, but I can't? So, of course I didn't say that to him, but for him, it was a lot of things, I think. And I, in the end, felt that he was doing what he felt was best. He didn't want to compare birdsong to human music because he really respects and is totally committed to what birds are saying, what they are making, and not to take the baggage, as he called it, of music, that word, creative, of that baggage, that human baggage, into understanding what birds are doing. And, even though he refused to really give me that word, I agreed with him. I think it's very, very important to, not just say, oh, here's creativity and animals can do this, so they must be creative. They do things that we cannot do.
Mm-hmm.
And they have, senses and qualities and behaviors that we do not have. And so, of course, their creativity is probably very different in many, many ways. I mean, I can point to those, qualities that I just talked about. But again, those are those are very abstract in many ways. And so I think they cover a lot of ground of, like flexibility. It's a very broad term. But I did really end up respecting his refusal to let me use the word just in case I was going to use it with the way he didn't like it. And of course, Richard Prum, who is a wonderful ornithologist and evolutionary biologist, and is just really fun to talk to. And I he's absolutely comfortable with complexity. I mean, the guy you just could sit back and listen to him all day. He's really quite, how can I say this? Even his, he was sort of creating as we were talking in a way, about things that he was looking at. So in some ways, those three people, I had the longest interviews with, but there were many other biologists, like the Holekamp team, that were studying creativity in hyenas. And that I thought was really incredible. And I was kind of in a rush when I got to that. And I was sort of like, I didn't think I had the time to interview. Now, of course, I'd like to go back and interview them. And that was that, just for the audience, that what they did was they, were in the field in Masamara with a particular group of hyenas, and hyenas are one of those animals that people seem to despise. And I mean, actually, I think they're quite beautiful, and I think people that work with them, and people in Africa who actually have them as, I don't know if you'd call it a pet, and I'm not so sure it's there's an ethical issue about it, but I think people that know them find them to be really, really quite interesting, and so it's really not just interesting, but kind of fabulous that these women decided to do this. But what they did was they offered the hyenas a box that they had to get open, and there was meat in the box. So they had to figure out how to get the latch open and to get into the box. And they studied, they took millions of miles of videotape documenting this. And what they found was it wasn't just persistence that really helped the most creative hyenas, at least in this instance, used, but it was also the ability to just look at it in different ways, not just continuing to use the same, pulling open the latch in the way that never worked. It was turning the box around and really playing with it in a way, which sort of goes back to the idea in the book that play is absolutely necessary for creativity.
Yeah, there's a few different points you made there that I want to follow up on, but maybe let's start with play. I think it's maybe an accessible way for people to think about non-human creativity. If you've played tug of war with your dog or whatever, that that they can pretend and they can switch up their tactics and act in new ways. But one of the maybe more surprising places that you look to play is in reptiles, in turtles, alligators, crocodiles. And honestly, throughout the book, there are a few different alligator crocodile examples that were some of the most surprising sections to me. And yeah, really interesting. And you have this fascinating anecdote of an alligator and an otter playing.
Yeah.
So maybe if you could start with sharing that, but then more generally talk about alligators.
Yeah, the wonderful story is about, and this is from a biologist, Vladimir Dimitz, who's done a lot of research on alligators and crocodiles. But this is alligators and otters that were in a particular pond, and there were a number of alligators, and they were sort of camped there, and the otters would tease the alligators, splashing them and stuff. And most of the alligators just ignored them, but one of the alligators would, spray them with water back, and he was obviously playing with them. And then at one point, one of the otters slipped and fell into the water. And, you're like, and disappeared. And then the alligator brought him back up and set him on the ground. What? I mean, they don't do that to people. They just kill a person. But, they were playing. And the alligator knew they were playing. The otter, at that point, probably was hoping that the alligator would remember. But then they continued to play. But, no more drowning, or almost drowning. And I just found that to be, I laughed out loud when I read that. And I just went around for like the day just so happy that I had found that. So yeah, this idea that play has different rules in many ways. That the idea that and we have, this kind of example in, sometimes you hear war stories where, two sides come together and they agree that they're not going to shoot each other for a holiday or something. Mm-hmm. And they play cards or something. And the rules are very different. Then they go back and, they could kill each other the next day. It's very strange to me. But for play, and Mark Bekoff actually does talk about this. His book, Wild Justice, I think is one that everyone should read. It really is a fascinating, and also Jessica Pierce is the other author, and they talk about the rules in play where you have to learn trust. You have to learn that if you bite too hard, if you happen to be a dog or a wolf, that maybe no one will play with you if you can't keep your teeth in your mouth. And so this idea of learning through play is one that has always been around, but it's not been looked at in quite the way that Mark and Jessica looked at it, in terms of being, really learning morality in a way, learning the mores of a particular species behavior. If you're a young wolf or a young dog, and we know that with our dogs too. I would think there's all kinds of rules that go on in the dog park, and if you watch, you will see them, and they're very specific. And if someone breaks it, it's pretty obvious. If someone goes against one of those and bites too hard, for instance, things change. But you asked me to talk a little bit about alligators. Yeah, I mean, again, here's an animal that we kind of are afraid of. We see as just an eating machine. Somebody, an alligators in Florida do kill dogs and once in a while people. And yet they have this other side, or rather they have a side, just like most humans. They can be really nice or really mean. And they court. There was an example about the one, actually this was a crocodile couple, and he would take the male alligator would take the female alligator, crocodile would take the female crocodile around the pool on his back, and just give her little rides. And also this playing with a particular kind of flower, bougainvillea, I hope I'm saying that right, I thought was really interesting, that that some alligators would have this really real fascination with bougainvilleas, and they would just play with them for a long time. Those kinds of things. And of course, I imagine you remember the dancing water of the alligator sexual courtship, where the male alligator does this incredible dance and arches his back in sort of a sin curve, and then goes beneath the water and makes the water dance. And that is courtship display for the female.
Mm-hmm.
And that I found really quite beautiful and fascinating. So, I think that those things were just in and of themselves. I think they would be something that might change people's mind as to, all the different aspects of life for animals, and that they are not just a predator or just prey.
Yeah, the courtship examples, I think, can maybe show one of the things you bring up, which is that the concept of creativity, it's individual creativity, but it has repercussions on cultural species and ecosystem levels. You mentioned Richard Prum earlier. You talk about his ideas on the evolution of beauty, when
Right.
the agency of females they're choosing, they like this particular
Right.
alligator's dance or this bird's song, or
Right.
and so can you maybe expand on his idea for those who haven't encountered that before?
Yeah. He talks about this in The Evolution of Beauty. I'm pretty sure that's the name. But he talks about a number of species that, and he's an ornithologist, so most of it was bird related, but where they, like bowerbirds, make these beautiful bowers for females, and they make them in shapes that are very elegant, and they do things like using false perspective, where they'll gather all these blue items, shining glass and eyeballs. That was really one thing, an eyeball. I don't know where they got that. And any kind of blue leaves and all kind, so that would make the entrance really engaging, so that if the female would come into the bower, that she might want to shag. It's like this is okay. But what's important, I think, that the important point that he makes in the book, I think, and other biologists are really looking into this in for instance, Birds of Paradise, is that the females are making the creative decisions, and the males are kind of, producing mating behaviors, songs, even the use of their feathers in a way that they know the females will like, so that the females really are the ones that are driving, in a way, that those evolutionary and biodiversity, the biodiverse ways in which these birds, like the bowerbirds and the Birds of Paradise, exist and continue to evolve. And he actually makes a point at the book that, this is not just some sort of human cultural thing, but it is the way evolution works. And I do think that's really, really interesting, that it is it is the females that really drive that, who they mate with has to come up to their standards of what they think is beautiful. And that doesn't happen, in all species. It may be different from species to species, but in those two bird species, it's pretty obvious that that's what's driving, because both of them have been documented quite a bit. There's tons of videos, and I think I say in the book, and it's very true, if you go to the Cornell ornithology lab and look at, for instance, the bird of paradise and videos and all the information that is there, you will become addicted. And you might as well just go on vacation for a while so that you can actually just enjoy it. I still do it once in a while just to up my day, cheer myself up, because it's so fascinating and so beautiful, even to us. And it's interesting to me that in the case of both the bowerbirds and the birds of paradise, that these things that animals create are beautiful to us. And I do make the point, though, in the book that aesthetics in human terms has changed quite a bit. And beauty is not the only idea that shapes aesthetics in humans. And, it's funny because if you're in the arts, you take that for granted. But if you're not, sometimes people think, oh, well, beauty is how all art is made, which is why a lot of people who don't speak art language or aren't familiar with art and its changes, don't always understand that something that looks absolutely ugly to them why is that art? And that's an interesting thing too, because we're kind of doing the same with what animals do. So a lot of creativity in animals, it may not look beautiful to us, or it may not look anything to us, let's put it that way, but it may be very creative. And we just haven't figured that out yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if any of you have not seen documentary footage on bowerbirds, I recommend looking that up after you're done listening to this podcast, making their little huts or bowers or whatever they are. But anyway, in reading about that chapter in animal architecture, I was reminded of the pufferfish, which makes basically little sand sculptures on the ocean floor to impress potential mates.
Yes.
And why I was thinking about this is a couple months back, I had an interview with Martha Nussbaum about her book Justice for Animals.
Uh-huh.
And overall, it's a fantastic book, and I really enjoyed the interview. But she talks about fish, and she thinks it's wrong to harm fish, but she doesn't necessarily think it's wrong to kill fish because she thinks that they seem to live in the moment. And one, even if this were true, I'm not sure it follows that we should kill them. But two, it's looking at some examples of fish life, it's hard to imagine that they're living fully in the moment, that they don't have some sense of their past and future.
Right.
The pufferfish was one example of that, but you talk about another in your book, which is the cleaner wrasse.
Right.
Can you tell us about these little fish that clean other fish?
Yeah, the cleaner fish do what the name says. They have a place where other fish can come and get all the little things that are on them cleaned off. And the cleaner fish enjoy this in some ways because, of course, they get to eat some of it. But they also, if they bite into the fish too hard, because the place that they're cleaning, there's mucus that tastes really good, then the fish that's being cleaned can get very angry and not come back. The person who studies this, it's just, kind of looked at this as a business and sort of looked at it as an economy. It's like a fish economy,
Mm-hmm.
and it very definitely has examples of fish being, or fishes, and in this case, particular fish, individual fish being, doing their job differently, and which ones might, be more popular, and which ones people wouldn't want to come back to because they would sort of go against what they were supposed to be doing and bite them. But also, the cleaner fish would not always treat the local fish as well as the passing by fish, or fishes. And I keep mixing that up because the idea that fish, using the word fish, is sort of saying that all the fish in the sea, which I think I have a number in the book at the time when it's from the fish database, are the same. They're just one group and they just sort of float from place to place, but they are individual fish. And that's Jonathan Balcombe makes that point in his book, What a Fish Knows. And so I make a point about using the word fishes. I definitely disagree with Nussbaum, Martha Nussbaum, and I respect her, but I don't agree at all with, for many reasons. And one of the things that I meant to say when we were talking about Prum was that one of the questions I asked him was, if you're doing all this research on individual birds and what they can do, how do you feel about killing birds? Has that changed? And he said, I can't tell you that I've thought that completely through. The thing I like about Richard Prum is that he's just so honest, but I don't think that if you are writing about animals in general that you pick you can pick a particular species, especially all the fish. I mean, there's so many fish. There are more fish than land animals, and can say, but it's okay to kill those. I do think that we make these decisions not based on any kind of scientific fact, any kind of reality, any kind of experience, but we base killing other animals on mostly our own needs, and that things that we just don't want to give up. And I say we, but I don't do that. But, a lot of people do. So I think that point about individual animals, both for fish and for the birds that Prum is talking about, or insects, the idea of the individual is, I think, one of the most important points in the book. I mean, the thing that I wanted to do with the book was to take animals out of this victim status. Now, I wrote a lot about animals as victims, and yes, they are in many ways because we treat them as such. But I wanted to put them into a human category that often is seen as very respected and also very unusual. And a lot of people say, oh, I wish I was creative. I think everybody's creative. I've taught many, many people, and I find every single person I've ever taught has been creative. Whether they wanted to use it, whether they had obstacles to that is another thing. But the main idea of the book was that the creativity of animals exists on the individual, group, species, and ecosystem level. And so the loss of an individual animal is the loss of that individual's unique contribution to those interacting levels. And, if we're wondering why we're losing biodiversity, well, that is definitely one of the biggest reasons. There's many things that we do to animals that curtails their contribution to biodiversity. And I'm not saying that that's only important for us, but it's important for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm glad you touched on that, because I think one of the things that, on the one hand, the book is interesting just as a catalog of interesting facts about animals, right? And interesting is underselling it. They're surprising, fascinating, etc. But you're making a moral, philosophical point as well.
Right.
That that this should change how we consider other animals, and then also a practical one of, if other animals are creatively shaping their own lives, the lives of their communities, the lives of entire ecosystems, then that absolutely impacts what is the good life for an animal, what conservation looks like, how to conserve biodiversity. Right. If we aren't considering that individual animal's perspective, then we're sort of missing how best to take care of the whole as well.
Yes.
So yeah, maybe just as a last question, were there any, have there been any particularly memorable or formative experiences you've had with other animals in person that have shaped your own views?
Yeah, I've had quite a few. I've been, I've always seemed to be around animals or have animals live with me. And, in terms of, more domestic pets like cats or dogs, I just wait, they come to me. I don't really have to do anything. And I accept that. I find that to be really helpful, because, if I feel like, my Great Pyrenees, people kind of laugh at this. She had her tail cut off in Texas, and she was in a high kill shelter. And I saw her in a video, and I really, as I'm kind of older now, and I was going to get an older small dog, which I've never had a small dog before, and I saw her, and I was like, oh, she's really nervous. I could just see her anxiety on the video. So I decided I would adopt her, and it took about 8. She had such terrible separation anxiety. The second night I had her, she ripped. I had a window open on the second floor. She went up there and she ripped open pushed the window up with her nose, ripped the screen, and dived out. And luckily, slid down the pergola into the neighbor's fenced yard. So thank goodness she did that. And I left her, I was gone for about an hour. And then I realized, oh my God, this is serious separation anxiety. So I worked for quite a long time with her, but she kind of decided at some point that she was going to solve the problem. And she did. She decided that if she sat on the dining room table, she's a big dog, she sat on the dining room table and she could see out the window where my car was parked. And she knew if I drove away with the car, then I was going to come back and park right there. And, that did it. I mean, I didn't say go sit on obviously, go sit on the dining room table. But I also thought to myself, yeah, I'm the right person, because not a lot of people would let their dogs sit on the dining room table. But I was like, if it makes her happy, great. Mm-hmm. And she doesn't do that any longer, but she did it for, I don't know, about 6 months or so. So, and now she's willing to, she's okay with the couch. She has taken over the couch completely, and I really can't sit there, but, I'm allowed to eat now on the dining room table.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. And is there anything else you want to add on your book or anything else?
I would just like to add to tell people, just, I know a lot of people who listen to this are animal people and probably already vegan and animal rights people. But, if you're just hearing this, just be open. That's all creativity is about, really. Just, and to understand other animals, just be open. Be open to things. There's so much incredible life going on all around us all the time. And if you're open to that, I think, it really would help you as a person, as a human being, and it would help the animals too.
Well, thank you so much, Carol Gigliotti. The book is The Creative Lives of Animals. Thanks for coming on the show.
Oh, I enjoyed it. Thank you so much. It was a lovely interview.
Thanks so much for listening. Again, this is the first in what is planned to be a 4-episode series on the theme of animal agency and how that could transform our relationship with other animals, our politics, and also just how it's often very cool. If you want early access to some of the future episodes in the series, the way to get that is to support this podcast on Patreon. I couldn't thank you enough if you go to patreon.com/storytellingpod, pick a level, and make just a small monthly payment to keep this podcast going, keep this podcast thriving. All right, that's all for now, and see us hopefully in a couple weeks with a new episode.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.